The icy wind cut through my bones as my own son's footsteps faded into the darkness, leaving me stranded, without supplies, in the unforgiving wilderness. His cruel laughter echoed off the mountain walls as he shouted back, "Let's see if you can survive this, old man!" He believed the freezing temperatures and hungry wolves would finish what he started, clearing his path to everything I owned. But 3 days later, when he smugly walked into the funeral home expecting to plan my burial, his face went white with shock. What happened in those mountains changed everything, and the surprise I had waiting for him would shake him to his core. Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The camping trip had been Tyler's idea. My 35-year-old son called me on a Tuesday evening in March, his voice unusually warm for someone who hadn't spoken to me in 6 months. "Dad, remember how we used to go camping when I was a kid? I've been thinking, maybe we should do that again, just the two of us." My coffee mug stopped halfway to my lips. Tyler suggesting family time was like finding water in a desert. I set the mug down carefully on Linda's old placemat. "That sounds wonderful, son." "Where were you thinking?" "Mount Harrison. You know that spot we used to love near Devil's Canyon?" Each word came out measured, controlled. "The remote area where nobody ever goes." My hands reached for the camping gear catalog on the kitchen counter. The father in me, the part that still remembered teaching him to tie fishing knots and build campfires, grabbed onto this invitation. 3 days later, I found myself driving up the winding mountain road in Tyler's truck, watching him grip the steering wheel with white knuckles. His phone buzzed constantly against the dashboard, and he kept picking it up despite the winding road. Each ping made his jaw clench tighter. "Is everything all right at work?" I asked. Tyler's shoulder twitched. He cranked the radio volume until the country music drowned out any chance of conversation. When I tried to point out the deer trail where we'd once tracked a magnificent 8-point buck, he stared straight ahead, his eyes flat as coins. The campsite he chose made my stomach tighten. This wasn't our usual spot with its gentle clearing and nearby stream. This place perched at the edge of a steep ravine, isolated and treacherous. "Tyler, are you sure about this location? It's pretty dangerous if the weather turns." "Don't worry about it, Dad. You're tougher than you look." He jammed tent stakes into the frozen ground with more force than necessary. That first night around the campfire, Tyler sat across from me, but his eyes never quite landed on my face. Instead, they tracked over my shoulders, my chest, my hands, like he was taking inventory. When I asked about his work, about the gambling debts that Mrs. Carter had mentioned seeing scattered from his mailbox, Tyler's fork stopped midway to his mouth. The beans slid off and plopped back onto his tin plate. "You know what your problem is, Dad?" His voice had gone cold, flat as winter lake ice. "You hold on to everything too tight. That house, the cabin by the lake, all of it. You act like you're going to live forever." My hands wrapped around my coffee cup, seeking warmth that wasn't there. "Tyler, what's this really about?" He stood up so fast his camping chair toppled backward. His boot connected with a burning log, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. Maybe it's time for a changing of the guard. Maybe some of us are tired of waiting around for our inheritance. The word inheritance hung between us. My throat closed up. The next morning, Tyler moved with sharp, efficient movements. He insisted we hike deeper into the wilderness to a spot he claimed had the best fishing. But I'd been coming to these mountains for 40 years, and I knew there was no lake where he was leading me. "Son, where exactly are we going?" "You'll see." His backpack rode high on his shoulders, stuffed fuller than mine. When I'd tried to help him pack that morning, he'd snapped the zipper shut and jerked it away from my reaching hands. We climbed for 3 hours through increasingly treacherous terrain. My lungs burned in the thin air, and sweat soaked through my layers despite the bitter cold. Tyler never slowed, never looked back, never asked if I needed to rest. Finally, we reached a desolate clearing surrounded by sheer cliff faces. The wind howled through the rock formations. Tyler set down his pack with exaggerated care and turned to face me. His eyes were empty, cold. "This is where we part ways, Dad." My hands started trembling. "What do you mean?" Tyler unzipped his pack and began pulling out my belongings. My water bottles, their plastic crinkling as he stuffed them into his own bag. My emergency beacon, its red surface catching the weak sunlight. Even the extra wool socks Linda had knitted for me years ago. I mean, this is where the old man finally learns what it means to be expendable. Each item disappeared into Tyler's pack. "See, Dad, I've got debts." Serious debts. The kind where bad people break your legs if you don't pay up. My knees wanted to buckle. "And you've been sitting on a fortune, playing the martyr, acting like you deserve it all because you sacrificed so much for me. I can help you with the money, son. We can figure this out together." My hands reached toward him, but he stepped back. Tyler's laugh cut through the mountain air like breaking glass. It bounced off the canyon walls and came back to us distorted, multiplied. "Help? You mean loan me money with conditions and lectures attached? No thanks. I'd rather just inherit it all at once. Clean and simple." He turned toward the trail that led back to warmth, safety, civilization. My legs moved without conscious thought, carrying me after him. "Tyler, wait! You can't just leave me here." He paused at the edge of the clearing. When he looked over his shoulder, his face held no more emotion than a store mannequin. "Let's see if you can survive this, old man." His voice carried across the ravine, echoing off stone walls. "Maybe the cold will teach you what I learned growing up poor because you spent everything on my medical bills." The crunch of his boots on frozen ground grew fainter with each step. I stood in that empty clearing, listening to my own son walking away, listening to the sound of my heart breaking in the silence between his footsteps. The wind picked up, cutting through my jacket. As the sound of Tyler's departure faded completely, something happened inside my chest. My spine straightened, my breathing slowed, my hands stopped shaking and curled into fists at my sides. I pulled out my phone, checking for signal bars. Nothing. The display showed 12% battery remaining, not enough to last long in these temperatures. Tyler had chosen our location well. This high up, with the surrounding peaks blocking signals, we were completely cut off from the outside world. Even if I found higher ground, the battery would likely die before I could reach a spot with coverage. And Tyler knew that. This isolation wasn't an accident. Tyler thought he was leaving a helpless old man to freeze to death. He had no idea that the helpless old man was actually a former Army Ranger who'd survived worse conditions than this. And he definitely didn't know about the small recording device I always carried in my jacket pocket, the one that had captured every word of his confession. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. I found shelter in what barely qualified as a cave, nothing more than a shallow depression where wind and time had carved out a pocket in the rock face. My fingers, already stiff and clumsy, gathered pine needles and dry brush. The muscle memory of Army Ranger training kicked in despite 30 years of rust. The flint in my jacket pocket, an old habit from military days that Tyler had missed, sparked against the steel of my belt buckle. Once, twice, 3 times before the tinder caught. The tiny flame trembled like a newborn bird, and I cupped my hands around it. As the fire flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls, my mind drifted to another camping trip in these same mountains. Tyler had been 8 years old then, his skin pale and translucent from 6 months of chemotherapy. We'd come to the safe, designated camping areas with bathrooms and park rangers and cell phone towers nearby. That night, 30 years ago, Tyler had curled up in his sleeping bag next to mine, his small hand reaching out to touch my arm in the darkness. "Daddy, will you always protect me?" My throat had closed up then, just like it was closing up now. "Always, buddy. No matter what. Even when I'm grown up? Especially when you're grown up." The 8-year-old boy with the bald head and big eyes had smiled then, satisfied with my promise. I'd meant every word. Even now, with ice forming in my beard and Tyler's betrayal still burning in my chest like acid, I still meant it. The second day, survival became a mathematics problem. Water equaled melted snow over carefully maintained fire. Food equaled whatever I could trap, catch, or identify as edible among the sparse winter vegetation. Warmth equaled constant movement, constant vigilance. My phone had died sometime during the first night, the cold and low battery finally defeating the device. Even if it had survived, there was no signal up here. Tyler had planned that detail too. My stomach had given up growling by noon and settled into a hollow ache that pulsed with my heartbeat. I'd been hungrier during military exercises, but my body wasn't 30 years younger anymore. Every movement cost energy I couldn't afford to spend, but staying still meant freezing. It was while checking the rabbit snare I'd constructed near a game trail that my boot kicked against something half buried under fallen leaves. Tyler's GPS device, its yellow case bright against the brown earth. My hands shook as I powered it on. The screen flickered to life, showing our route clearly marked with electronic breadcrumbs. More importantly, it showed waypoints Tyler had saved during his planning phase. Base camp. Final approach. And one that made my blood freeze all over again. Pickup point. Located 5 miles from where I stood, right next to an old logging road. Tyler hadn't gotten lost. He didn't panic and run. He'd planned his exit route with the same methodical precision he'd used to plan my death. The GPS device felt heavy in my hands, but it was what I found next that transformed my understanding completely. A manila envelope, water-stained but still readable, wedged between 2 rocks where Tyler had obviously stopped to reorganize his gear. My fingers tore at the seal, and the papers inside changed everything. Life insurance documents. $2 million, with Tyler Morrison listed as sole beneficiary. The policy date was 6 weeks old, taken out just after Tyler's latest gambling binge. The policy contained specific language about accidental death benefits with double payouts for deaths occurring in wilderness areas due to exposure or animal attacks. Tyler hadn't just decided to kill me on impulse. This was a premeditated murder. I sat in the snow holding the evidence of my son's betrayal and thought about Linda. About the promise I'd made at her bedside 10 years ago while machines beeped around her failing body. "Take care of our boy, Frank." Her voice had been barely a whisper, her hand cold in mine. "He's all we have." She'd used her last breaths to worry about Tyler's future, even as cancer ate away her strength. I'd held her hand and promised, yes, I would take care of him. I would protect him. I would sacrifice whatever it took to make sure he had a future, and I had sacrificed. When Tyler got sick 2 years after Linda's death, I'd sold our dream house to pay for experimental treatments. I'd taken out loans against my mechanic shop, emptied our savings, and worked 70-hour weeks. When Tyler recovered and wanted to go to college, I'd mortgage the shop again. When he started his business and needed capital, I'd liquidated my retirement fund. When his gambling addiction started generating debts, I'd quietly paid them off. But somewhere in all that giving, all that protecting, all that sacrificing, Tyler had stopped being Linda's sweet boy and become something else. The third day brought a clarity that cut through my despair like sunlight through storm clouds. I wasn't going to die in these mountains. Tyler's plan would fail, not because of luck or chance, but because he'd underestimated the man who'd raised him. Using Tyler's own GPS device, I followed deer trails that had been carved into these mountains long before humans arrived. The animals knew the safest routes, the hidden paths that avoided the worst of the terrain. My legs moved steadily despite 3 days of minimal food. The pickup point on Tyler's GPS turned out to be exactly what I'd expected, an old logging road that connected to the main highway 20 miles down the mountain. I built a signal fire using techniques from my Army days, creating thick black smoke that could be seen for miles. The park ranger who stopped was young, maybe Tyler's age, with concerned eyes and a radio crackling with static on her belt. "Sir, are you all right? How did you get out of here without gear? My son and I got separated during a camping trip." The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. "Could you possibly give me a ride to town? I need to get home." She radioed in my location, concerned about my condition, but I assured her I was fine. "Actually," I said, "could you do me a favor? Don't report that you found me just yet. I need to handle something first, and if my son finds out I'm safe before I'm ready." Rebecca studied my face, perhaps sensing something in my tone. "Sir, there's an active search for you. Your son filed a missing persons report." "I understand, but please just give me a few hours. I promise I'll contact the authorities myself once I'm in town. There are complications I need to sort out first." She hesitated, clearly torn between protocol and something she heard in my voice. I could get in trouble for this. "Just a few hours, please." Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "I'll hold off on the radio report until my shift ends at 6. That gives you about 3 hours. During the drive down the mountain, Rebecca, that was her name, Officer Rebecca Collins, filled me in on details I hadn't known. Tyler had contacted the sheriff's department 2 days ago, filing a missing persons report. He'd told them his elderly father had wandered off during the night, possibly suffering from early-stage dementia. "Your son seemed really broken up about it," Rebecca said, navigating the winding road with practiced ease. "He's been coordinating with search and rescue, checking in every few hours for updates." Such a devoted son. My jaw clenched. "I'm sure he's been very cooperative. He mentioned that you'd been showing signs of confusion lately, memory problems. Said he was worried about leaving you alone, but you'd insisted on the camping trip." Rebecca glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Are you sure you don't want me to radio this in?" "He's probably worried sick." "I'm sure he is," I said. "But please, just give me those few hours we discussed. There are things I need to take care of first." I let her believe what she wanted to believe. The truth would come out soon enough. She dropped me off at the edge of town as requested, reminding me of our agreement. 3 hours, Mr. Morrison. After that, I have to file my report. That's all I need, I assured her. Morrison's funeral home sat on Maple Street like it had for 60 years. Its Victorian architecture designed to comfort the grieving with warm yellow light and peaceful dignity. Through the large front windows, I could see fresh flower arrangements and oak caskets displayed with reverent care. I checked my watch, 3:47 p.m., exactly 72 hours after Tyler had walked away and left me to freeze. According to Rebecca, he'd told the authorities he was stopping by Morrison's today to discuss options, pending the recovery of my body. Tyler thought he was coming to plan my funeral. Instead, he was about to discover that reports of my death had been greatly exaggerated. During the drive down the mountain, I'd managed to charge my phone using Rebecca's car charger. After 3 days in the wilderness with a dead phone and no signal, I finally had both power and connectivity again. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Detective Martinez's number. We'd met when Tyler was arrested for drunk driving 2 years ago. "Detective Martinez? This is Frank Morrison. I need to report an attempted murder." "Mr. Morrison?" Detective Martinez's voice carried confusion that rippled through the phone line. "Sir, your son reported you missing 3 days ago. We've had search and rescue teams looking for you." I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the click of computer keys, the low murmur of police station activity. "That's exactly what I need to talk to you about, Detective. Tyler didn't report me missing because he was concerned. He reported me missing because he left me to die and wanted to establish his alibi." The line went quiet, except for the sound of Detective Martinez's breathing. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into cop mode, sharp, focused. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to come in immediately. Can you get to the station?" 25 minutes later, I sat in a small interview room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant, watching Detective Martinez's expression change as I played the recording from my jacket pocket. Tyler's voice filled the space between us, each word landing like a physical blow. This is where the old man finally learns what it means to be expendable. I'd rather just inherit it all at once, clean and simple. Detective Martinez stopped the recording, her fingers pressed against her temples. "Mr. Morrison, This is attempted murder. If what you're telling me is true, we're also looking at insurance fraud, possibly conspiracy." I slid the life insurance documents across the table. The papers rustled against the worn formica surface. $2 million, detective. Policy was taken out 6 weeks ago, right after Tyler's latest gambling binge. She studied the paperwork with the intensity of a surgeon examining x-rays, her jaw tightening with each clause she read. The timing is suspicious, but Tyler has spent 3 days building an image as the concerned son. The entire community sees him as the devoted family member desperately searching for his missing father. "What do you recommend?" Detective Martinez leaned back in her chair, which creaked softly under her weight. "We let him make his next move, but we'll be watching every step." She fixed me with a stare. "Frank, where are you planning to go when you leave here?" The question followed me as I drove through town in the rental car Detective Martinez had helped me arrange. The house where Linda and I had built our life together felt poisoned now. The cabin by the lake, our retirement dream, held memories that would be forever tainted. Even my mechanic shop seemed hollow. Instead, I found myself parked across from Morrison's funeral home, engine idling, watching through the large Victorian windows. Warm yellow light spilled onto the sidewalk, and I could see fresh flower arrangements positioned with careful reverence. Tyler was already inside. Even from this distance, his performance was visible. The slumped shoulders that spoke of unbearable grief, the tissue that constantly dabbed at his eyes, the trembling hand as he gestured toward different options in whatever catalog Mr. Henderson was showing him. My phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. "Subject has arrived with female companion, multiple units in position, awaiting your signal." Detective Martinez's people were everywhere, invisible but watching. Through the window, I watched Tyler lean forward earnestly as he spoke with Mr. Henderson. They were examining a display of caskets now, Tyler apparently preferring the mahogany model with brass handles. I could imagine his words. "Dad deserves the best. He worked so hard his whole life, sacrificed everything for his family." That's when she appeared. A young woman with long dark hair and clothing that cost more than most people spent on rent. She walked into the funeral home like she belonged there. When she reached Tyler's side, her hand found his arm with practiced familiarity, and she leaned close to whisper something in his ear. This wasn't a friend offering comfort. This was intimacy, partnership, conspiracy. My phone rang. Detective Martinez's voice tight with discovery. "Frank, we've identified the woman. Amanda Pierce, 28 years old. She's been living with Tyler for the past 6 months, but they've kept it quiet. Financial records show coordinated activity. They've been shopping for life insurance policies together, researching wilderness survival statistics, even checking average response times for mountain rescue operations. Tyler hadn't planned this alone. Amanda hadn't just encouraged him. She'd been the architect, the mastermind behind the technical details. Tyler was impulsive, emotional, prone to gambling and bad decisions. But this level of premeditation required a different kind of mind. Through the window, I could see Tyler becoming agitated. Mr. Henderson was asking questions about death certificates, about the location of my body, about official documentation Tyler couldn't provide. Amanda kept touching his arm, trying to calm him down. But Tyler's gestures were becoming more erratic. His voice was rising. I could see Mr. Henderson glanced around nervously. "Detective," I said into the phone, "I think it's time. Frank, are you absolutely certain you're ready for this? Once we move, there's no going back." I thought about the 8-year-old boy who'd reached for my hand in the darkness of a camping tent 30 years ago, about the teenager who'd fought leukemia with courage that made grown men weep, about the young man who'd graduated college with honors. But I also thought about the man who'd looked me in the eye 3 days ago and told me I was expendable, who'd calculated the value of my life in insurance payouts, who'd walked away from my cries for help without looking back. "I'm ready, Detective." I crossed the street with steady steps, my breath visible in the cool evening air. The brass handle of Morrison's funeral home felt solid under my palm. The door chime announced my arrival with a soft, musical note that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed. 3 heads turned toward me in perfect synchronization. Mr. Henderson's professional composure cracked visibly, confusion replacing the practiced sympathy he'd been offering my grieving son. Amanda's face went white beneath her carefully applied makeup, her expensive handbag slipping from nerveless fingers to hit the carpet with a soft thud. But Tyler's reaction was something beyond shock, beyond surprise, beyond fear. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his eyes wide enough to show white all around the irises. The tissue he'd been using for his performance fell from his hand and drifted down like a small surrender flag. The color drained from his face so completely that for a moment I worried he might actually faint. His hand shot out to grip the edge of Mr. Henderson's desk, knuckles white with the effort of keeping himself upright. "Hello, son," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed atmosphere of the funeral home. "I hear you're here to plan my burial." "How thoughtful of you to handle the arrangements personally." Tyler's throat worked like he was trying to swallow something that wouldn't go down. When he finally found his voice, it came out as a croak. You can't be here. You're supposed to be." "Dead?" I finished, taking another step into the room. The carpet was thick under my feet. "Yes, I imagine that was the plan. But as you can see, reports of my demise have been greatly exaggerated." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "I'm terribly sorry, but there seems to be some confusion. Are you the deceased gentleman or—" "Very much alive, thank you." I kept my eyes on Tyler, watching him struggle to process my presence. "Though I understand my son here has been making quite elaborate arrangements for my funeral." "Tell me, Tyler, did you already pick out flowers? I've always been partial to lilies. They were your mother's favorite." Amanda grabbed Tyler's arm, her manicured nails digging into his jacket sleeve. "We need to leave," she hissed, her voice carrying an edge of panic. "Right now." But Tyler couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at me like I was a ghost that had materialized from his worst nightmare. The front door chimed again, and Detective Martinez stepped inside with 2 uniformed officers. Their presence filled the funeral home's peaceful atmosphere with an electricity that made everyone's posture stiffen. "Nobody leaves just yet," Detective Martinez said politely, but her hand rested on her service weapon. "We have some questions that need answering." Tyler found his voice then, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "Dad, please." "I can explain. This isn't what it looks like." I pulled out my phone and Tyler's eyes focused on it with the intensity of a man watching his own execution. "Really, son? Because it looks like you tried to murder me for insurance money, then came here to plan my funeral before my body was even found." I pressed play, and Tyler's recorded voice filled Morrison's funeral home with his confession, each word echoing off the walls like gunshots. The silence in Morrison's funeral home stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Tyler's Adam's apple bobbed frantically as he tried to swallow, tried to speak, tried to make sense of the impossible sight of his very much alive father standing in the doorway. Sweat had broken out across his forehead despite the comfortable temperature, tiny beads that caught the warm yellow light. Amanda's designer handbag hit the carpet with a muffled thud as her nerveless fingers lost their grip. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere. Her breathing had gone shallow and quick, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession. Mr. Henderson, a man who'd navigated 40 years of family drama with professional grace, stood frozen behind his mahogany desk. His usually steady hands trembled slightly as he set down the funeral brochure he'd been showing Tyler, the pages rustling. "Mr. Morrison," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. We were under the impression that you were, that is to say, your son informed us." "That I was dead?" I finished, taking another step into the room. My boots made no sound on the thick carpet, but Tyler flinched anyway. "Yes, I can see how that would create some confusion." I pulled out my phone, and Tyler's eyes locked onto it with the intensity of a man watching his own execution warrant being signed. His pupils had contracted to pinpricks, and a muscle in his jaw twitched erratically. When I pressed play, his recorded voice filled the funeral home. This is where the old man finally learns what it means to be expendable. I'd rather just inherit it all at once, clean and simple. Tyler's face went through a spectrum of colors, from ashen gray to sickly green to a mottled red that spoke of blood pressure spiking into dangerous territory. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "Stop," he whispered, then louder, more desperate. "Stop it! Turn it off!" But the recording continued, relentless as truth itself. Amanda had backed against the wall, her expensive coat pressed against the floral wallpaper. Her perfectly manicured nails scraped against the wallpaper, leaving tiny marks. Detective Martinez and her officers stepped forward, their presence filling the funeral home with an electricity that made everyone's hair stand on end. Tyler's head whipped back and forth between them and me, his eyes wild with the kind of panic that comes when all escape routes are suddenly blocked. "Tyler Morrison," Detective Martinez said, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "You're under arrest for attempted murder and insurance fraud." The words hit Tyler like physical blows. His knees buckled, and he grabbed the edge of Mr. Henderson's desk so hard his knuckles went white. The wedding ring Linda had placed on his finger during his brief marriage years ago caught the light. "Wait!" The word tore out of Tyler's throat. "You don't understand. This was all Amanda's idea. She's the one who said we needed the money. She's the one who found out about the insurance. She planned the whole thing." Amanda's gasp was audible even over the sound of handcuffs clicking open, her face contorted with betrayal, disbelief, and rage. "Tyler, what are you doing? I'm not going to prison for you." Tyler's voice cracked like breaking glass as he turned to Detective Martinez with wild, desperate eyes. "She's been planning this for months. Check her computer, check her browser history. She researched wilderness deaths, hypothermia statistics. She even looked up how long it takes for search and rescue to find bodies in remote areas." Tyler's words tumbled out in a rushing torrent, each accusation accompanied by increasingly frantic gestures. Spittle flew from his mouth as he spoke, and his hands shook so violently he could barely point at Amanda. "You coward!" Amanda hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "This was your debt, your problem. I was trying to help you. Help me!" Tyler's laugh was high-pitched, hysterical. "You were trying to get rich. You said my father was a burden, that he was holding me back, that we deserved his money more than he did." Amanda's mask slipped completely then, revealing something cold and calculating beneath her carefully constructed exterior. Her voice turned sharp as a blade. "Your father was in the way. He was sitting on a fortune while you owed $300,000 to people who break legs for late payments." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Mr. Henderson sank into his chair, his professional composure finally cracking completely. "Amanda Pierce," Detective Martinez said, producing a second pair of handcuffs, "you're also under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud." As the officers moved toward them, Amanda and Tyler turned on each other with the viciousness of cornered animals. Tyler grabbed Amanda's arm, his fingers digging into her expensive coat. "Tell them! Tell them whose idea this really was." Amanda wrenched her arm away, leaving wrinkles in the fabric where his fingers had been. "I never told you to actually kill him. I thought you were just going to scare him, maybe make him realize how serious your debts were." "Liar!" Tyler's voice rose to nearly a shout, echoing off the funeral home walls. "You're the one who researched the insurance policies. You're the one who said it had to look like an accident. And you're the one who actually took him up there and left him to die," Amanda shot back, her composure finally cracking completely. Tears ran down her cheeks, carrying her makeup with them in dark streams. "I never thought you'd actually go through with it." I watched this display of mutual betrayal, with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, wasn't quite pain, but existed somewhere in between. Tyler looked at me over his shoulder as Officer Williams guided him toward the door, the handcuffs gleaming silver against his wrists. His eyes were red-rimmed and desperate, filled with a pleading that reminded me, for just a moment, of the little boy he'd once been. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice broken and raw. "I'm your son. You can't let them do this to me." The words hit me somewhere deep in my chest, in a place that still remembered the 8-year-old boy who'd fought leukemia with such courage. But that little boy had grown into a man who'd tried to murder his own father for money. "You stopped being my son the moment you walked away and left me to die in those mountains," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Tyler's face crumpled like a discarded paper mask, revealing something broken and desperate underneath. "But the money!" Tyler's voice rose in desperation, cracking on the words. "The debts, the people I owe, they'll kill me if I can't pay." "Then you should have come to me for help instead of trying to murder me for the insurance payout." Tyler's shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I was scared, Dad. I was so scared. The interest keeps growing, and they said if I don't pay soon." "Fear doesn't justify murder, son." Amanda was still crying as Officer Martinez led her past me, her expensive clothes wrinkled and her makeup ruined. But when she looked at me, her eyes held no remorse, only anger at being caught. "Mr. Morrison," she said, stopping despite the officer's gentle pressure on her arm, "you don't understand what Tyler owes. $300,000 to some very dangerous people. We were desperate." "Desperate enough to commit murder," Detective Martinez observed dryly. "That's what we call premeditation." As they were led away, Tyler made one last, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his plan. "Dad! The will! You never changed the will. Even if you hate me, I'm still your only heir." I waited until the police cars had driven away, their red and blue lights fading into the distance, before I answered the question he'd left hanging in the air. Mr. Henderson was still sitting behind his desk, looking shell-shocked by what he'd witnessed. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice sounding strangely normal after everything that had just happened, "I apologize for the disruption to your business. I imagine this is the first time someone has attended their own funeral planning session." He managed a weak smile, his hands still trembling slightly as he straightened his tie. "In 40 years, Mr. Morrison, this is definitely a first. How are you holding up? This must be incredibly difficult." The question caught me off guard. How was I holding up? 3 days ago, I'd been a father with a complicated but ultimately beloved son. Now I was a man whose child had tried to murder him for money. "I will be," I said finally, the words feeling strange on my tongue. "Mr. Henderson, what happens to funeral arrangements when the deceased turns out not to be deceased?" "Well," he said, loosening his tie and running a hand through his gray hair, "we simply cancel the arrangements and refund any deposits. Though I must say, the situation is completely unprecedented in my experience." "Keep the deposit," I said, pulling out my wallet and placing several bills on his desk. "Consider it payment for the most unusual business meeting of your career." As I walked back to my rental car, the weight of what had just happened began to settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Martinez. "Insurance investigator confirms Tyler contacted them 2 weeks ago asking about claim procedures for wilderness deaths. This case is airtight. Thank you for your courage." I sat in the car for a long time, engine off, staring at the funeral home where my son had come to celebrate my death and plan his financial future. The spring evening was warm, a stark contrast to the frozen mountain where Tyler had left me to die just 3 days ago. Somewhere in the city jail, Tyler was probably still insisting this was all Amanda's fault. Amanda was probably telling anyone who would listen that Tyler was a gambling addict who'd dragged her into his scheme. Both of them were probably wondering how their foolproof plan had gone so catastrophically wrong. Neither of them knew about the most important detail of all. 3 months ago, after discovering Tyler's latest gambling debts through a chance encounter with one of his creditors at the hardware store, I'd quietly made an appointment with my lawyer and changed my will completely. The trial took place 6 months later, when October had painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me of fire. I sat in the witness box, my hands folded in my lap, watching the jury's faces as I recounted those 3 days of survival. Some leaned forward with fascination. Others sat back with visible discomfort. Tyler sat at the defendant's table, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits he used to wear. His face had grown gaunt during his months in jail, his cheekbones sharp as broken glass. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his hands shook with a fine tremor that hadn't been there before. When our eyes met across the courtroom, he looked away quickly, his Adam's apple bobbing. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Mills, led me through the testimony with surgical precision. "Mr. Morrison, can you describe your son's demeanor when he left you in the wilderness?" "Cold," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtroom. "Calculating, like he was completing a business transaction rather than abandoning his father to die." Tyler's shoulders hunched forward at my words, and his attorney placed a steadying hand on his arm. Amanda sat at her own table nearby, her designer clothes replaced with a plain gray suit that made her look younger, more vulnerable. Her dark hair had been cut short. The defense attorney, a thin man with nervous energy, tried to paint Tyler as a victim of circumstances. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said during his closing argument, his voice rising with manufactured passion, "Tyler Morrison is not a cold-blooded killer. He's a desperate young man who made terrible choices under crushing financial pressure. This was a cry for help, not a calculated murder attempt." The prosecutor's response was swift and merciless. She played the recording again, Tyler's voice filling the courtroom with his confession. The jury members' faces hardened as they heard him describe leaving me to die. "This was not desperation," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a sword. "This was premeditation. This was greed. This was a son who calculated the value of his father's life in insurance dollars and found it wanting." The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 47 minutes. I know because I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, watching the clock tick away the minutes, listening to my own heartbeat echo in my ears. When they returned, their faces were grim, resolved. Tyler Morrison, guilty of attempted murder in the first degree, guilty of insurance fraud, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Tyler's knees buckled when the verdict was read. He grabbed the edge of the defendant's table, his knuckles white as bone, his breathing rapid and shallow. A strangled sound escaped his throat, somewhere between a sob and a moan. For a moment, I saw not the man who'd tried to kill me, but the frightened child he'd been during his cancer treatments. Scared, vulnerable, looking for someone to save him. Amanda Pierce. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of insurance fraud, guilty of accessory to attempted murder. Amanda's reaction was different. She sat perfectly still, her face a mask of resigned acceptance. Only her hands betrayed her emotions, clenched so tightly in her lap that her fingernails left crescent-shaped marks in her palms. When the bailiff approached her with handcuffs, she stood gracefully. Tyler got 25 years to life. Amanda got 15 years. The judge's words echoed in the courtroom. The defendants will be eligible for parole, but not for a considerable time. I felt no triumph watching them led away in shackles, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor of the courthouse. Tyler turned back one last time, his eyes searching mine for something, forgiveness, understanding, the love that had once existed between us. I held his gaze steadily. The real surprise came during the reading of my will, which I'd requested be done publicly as part of Tyler's sentencing hearing. Judge Harrison agreed, saying it was relevant to understanding the full scope of the insurance fraud charges. My lawyer, William Thompson, a distinguished man with silver hair and 30 years of estate law experience, stood at the podium with the documents that would determine Tyler's future. The courtroom was packed with reporters, neighbors, and curious observers who'd been following the case. "To my son, Tyler Morrison," William read, his voice carrying clearly in the silent courtroom, "who attempted to murder me for financial gain, I leave the sum of $1 to be paid in 4 quarterly installments of 25 cents each." Tyler's head snapped up from the defendant's table like he'd been electrocuted. His mouth fell open, and his eyes went wide with shock that seemed to echo through his entire body. Even his attorney looked stunned. "The remainder of my estate," William continued, "including all property, investments, and life insurance benefits, will be donated to the Children's Cancer Research Foundation, in memory of my late wife, Linda Morrison, and in honor of all the children currently fighting the same battle my son fought and won 30 years ago." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers, but I kept my eyes fixed on Tyler. His face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally something that might have been understanding. His shoulders began to shake, and tears ran down his cheeks in silver streams. "Additionally," William said, waiting for the noise to die down, "all proceeds from the life insurance policy that Mr. Tyler Morrison attempted to fraudulently claim will also be donated to the same foundation, along with any future earnings from the sale of my mechanical repair shop." I stood up from my seat in the gallery and walked to the defendant's table. Tyler looked up at me with eyes red-rimmed from crying, his face a map of pain and regret. In that moment, I chose to believe it was real, not because Tyler deserved my faith, but because I needed to hold on to some shred of the boy I'd raised. "Tyler," I said quietly, pitching my voice so only he could hear, 30 years ago, when you were fighting leukemia, other families donated money to help pay for your treatment. Families who didn't know us, who gave money they couldn't afford because they believed in helping sick children. Do you remember Mrs. Patterson from down the street? She brought us casseroles every week and slipped envelopes of cash under our door when she thought we weren't looking." Tyler's throat worked as he tried to swallow, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. "I remember," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the courtroom murmur. "She was on a fixed income, Tyler. Social Security and nothing else, but she gave what she could because she believed in hope, in second chances, in the idea that helping others makes us human." I paused, letting the words settle between us. "Your mother and I always planned to pay that kindness forward someday." Tyler's voice came out as a broken whisper, each word seeming to cost him enormous effort. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The words hit me in the chest like physical blows, and for a moment, I wavered. This was still my son, the child I'd rocked to sleep during nightmares, the boy who'd fought cancer with such courage that nurses wept watching him. But I forced myself to remember the cold calculation in his voice as he walked away from me in those mountains. "I know you are, son. But sorry doesn't undo what you tried to do. This way, at least something good comes from all this pain." I turned to leave, but Tyler's voice stopped me, raw with desperation, and something that sounded like genuine anguish. "The cabin by the lake. Mom's dream house. You're giving that away too?" I looked back at him one last time, seeing not just the man who'd tried to kill me, but also the 8-year-old boy who'd once sat beside Linda's hospital bed, holding her hand while she slept between chemotherapy sessions. That boy had promised her he'd always be good, always take care of Daddy, always remember how much she loved him. "Tyler," I said, my voice carrying clearly despite the emotion threatening to break it, "your mother's dream wasn't the house. Her dream was raising a son who would grow up to be a good man. That dream died in those mountains when you walked away and left me to freeze." Tyler's face crumpled completely then, his composure dissolving like sugar in rain. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. The sound echoed through the courtroom, raw and primal and utterly broken. Several jurors looked away. Amanda watched this display with cold calculation, her eyes moving between Tyler and me. When she caught me looking at her, she lifted her chin defiantly. There was no remorse in her expression. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet courtroom with surprising steadiness, "you'll never understand what it's like to be young and desperate, to see opportunities slipping away while old people hoard wealth they'll never use." The words were meant to wound, but they bounced off me like rain off glass. I'd heard similar arguments from Tyler during our final confrontation in the mountains. "Amanda, I was young once too. I was desperate when Tyler got sick, when Linda was dying, when bills piled up faster than I could pay them. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, sold everything I owned, slept in hospital chairs for months." I paused, letting my words sink in. "But I never considered murder as a solution to my problems." She looked away then, her defiance cracking just enough to show the fear underneath. The bailiff stepped forward to escort the defendants back to their cells, but Tyler looked over his shoulder one more time, his face streaked with tears. "Dad," he called out, his voice echoing in the marble halls of justice, cracking on the single syllable, "Will you ever forgive me?" I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of 35 years of fatherhood pressing down on my shoulders. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for my answer. The question carried more weight than all the legal proceedings. The answer came from somewhere deeper than thought, deeper than anger, deeper than the pain that still lived in my chest. "Tyler," I said finally, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtroom, "forgiveness isn't something I can give you like a birthday present. It's something you'll have to find for yourself through the choices you make and the man you decide to become." The courtroom doors closed behind them with a sound like thunder, final and absolute. I stood there in the sudden quiet, surrounded by strangers and reporters and the echoes of a family that had torn itself apart over money and desperation and choices that could never be undone. 6 months later, I attended the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Linda Morrison Children's Cancer Wing at St. Mary's Hospital. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. My breath formed small clouds as I spoke with Dr. Patricia Williams, the head of pediatric oncology, watching bulldozers break ground where hope would soon take root. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Williams said, her eyes bright with excitement, "your donation has made this wing possible. We estimate it will help us save hundreds of children over the coming years." The numbers felt abstract until she led me inside to meet some of the current patients. 7-year-old Marcus reminded me so much of Tyler at that age that my chest tightened. He had the same stubborn cowlick that refused to stay down, the same bright eyes that seemed too old for his face. His mother sat beside his hospital bed, her hand resting protectively on his arm. "Are you the man who's building us a new wing?" Marcus asked, his voice weak but curious. "I helped make it possible," I said, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "What's your favorite part about the hospital?" "The playroom," he said without hesitation. "But it's pretty small. Sometimes there's not enough room for everyone. Well, the new wing will have a much bigger playroom, and a game room with video games, and a movie theater where you can watch films with your family." Marcus's eyes widened, and for a moment the resemblance to young Tyler was so strong I had to look away. His mother noticed, her own eyes filling with tears that she tried to blink away. I spent an hour with Marcus and his family, then visited 12-year-old Sarah, who was fighting osteosarcoma with a determination that reminded me of Linda during her final months. Sarah's room was covered with get-well cards from her classmates. "My mom says you lost someone to cancer too," Sarah said, with the directness that only children possess. "My wife, Tyler's mother. She fought very hard, just like you're doing." "Did she win?" The question hung in the air between us, simple and impossible. "She fought with everything she had." "Sometimes that's the only victory that matters." Sarah nodded solemnly, as if she understood something about fighting that most adults never learn. Her parents stood nearby, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion that comes from watching your child battle an enemy you can't see or touch. On my way out, I stopped at the memorial wall where families had placed photos and messages for loved ones they'd lost. Linda's picture smiled back at me from among dozens of others, mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, all taken too soon. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Tyler's contact information. For 6 months, I'd been writing him letters about the children receiving treatment in the wing named after his mother. Short messages telling him about Marcus's progress, Sarah's courage, the families who were getting help because of what his crime had unexpectedly made possible. Tyler had never written back, but the letters weren't returned either. I hoped that meant he was reading them, that somewhere in the concrete and steel of his prison cell, he was learning about the lives being saved in Linda's name. My fingers hovered over the phone's keyboard, composing another message. Tyler, Marcus rang the bell today. 7 years old, leukemia survivor, just like you were. His family cried happy tears in the hallway. Thought you should know that some good came from all this pain. Love, Dad. I almost sent it. My thumb moved toward the send button, paused, moved away. Tyler needed to find his own path to redemption. My job wasn't to make that journey easier for him, only to document the good that had somehow emerged from the wreckage. Instead, I drove to Linda's grave, a quiet spot on a hill overlooking the lake where we'd planned to spend our golden years together. The headstone was simple granite, etched with her name and the dates that bookended a life cut too short. Fresh flowers lay against the stone, chrysanthemums in autumn colors. I sat on the ground beside her grave, something I hadn't done in years, letting the dampness seep through my jeans. The October wind rustled through the oak trees overhead, sending leaves spiraling down like golden snow. Linda, I said aloud, my voice carrying across the empty cemetery. I kept my promise. I protected him, even from himself, but not the way we thought I would. A red cardinal landed on her headstone, bright as a flame against the gray granite. Linda had always loved cardinals, claiming they were messages from people we'd lost. The bird cocked its head and looked at me for a long moment, as if it was listening, before flying away toward the lake. The cabin's going to become a retreat center for families dealing with cancer, I continued. The foundation will use it to give parents a place to rest while their children are in treatment. I think you'd like that better than us just sitting there feeling sorry for ourselves. The wind picked up, sending more leaves dancing around the headstone. I pulled my jacket tighter, but made no move to leave. After 6 months of court dates and legal proceedings, and trying to make sense of how my life had been turned upside down, this quiet hillside felt like the first peaceful place I'd found. Tyler asked if I'll ever forgive him, I said, my words disappearing into the autumn air. I told him that forgiveness isn't mine to give, but sitting here now, I think maybe I was wrong about that. A squirrel scampered across the path nearby, cheek stuffed with acorns, preparing for winter with the kind of focused determination that reminded me of Linda attacking her Christmas shopping list every November. The thought made me smile, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. I can forgive him, I said quietly. I can forgive the scared boy who made terrible choices, but I can't forget what he did, and I can't pretend it didn't change everything between us. Maybe that's enough. Maybe forgiveness doesn't have to mean going back to the way things were. The cardinal returned, landing on a nearby oak branch, its red feathers brilliant against the golden leaves. It stayed there for several minutes, watching me with bright black eyes, before flying away again toward the setting sun. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff from sitting on the cold ground, and brushed the dirt off my jeans. The drive home would take 20 minutes, leading me to a house that felt different now, emptier, but somehow more honest. Tyler's childhood bedroom remained unchanged, but I'd stopped thinking of it as a shrine to better times. Now it was just a room waiting for a new purpose. Tomorrow, I will visit my lawyer to finalize the sale of the mechanic shop. Next week, I will meet with the architectural firm designing the Cancer Retreat Center. Next month, I will attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new hospital wing. But tonight, I would go home and sit in Linda's favorite chair, surrounded by photo albums filled with pictures of the family we used to be. I would remember the good times without flinching from the painful ones. I would hold space for both the Tyler who'd held my hand during his cancer treatments and the Tyler who'd left me to die in the mountains. And maybe, if I was very lucky, I would find a way to live with both truths at the same time. Tyler had tried to steal my life for money. Instead, his crime had given life to children who desperately needed it. Sometimes justice works in mysterious ways, and sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the most unexpected redemptions. Not redemption for Tyler. That was a journey he'd have to make on his own, if he ever chose to make it at all. But redemption for the pain, for the broken trust, for the shattered dreams of what our family might have been. As I reached my car and looked back up at the mountains one last time, I realized something that would have surprised the man I was a year ago. I was grateful. Not grateful for Tyler's betrayal, not grateful for the pain he'd caused, but grateful for the opportunity to turn something ugly into something beautiful. Linda would have liked that, I thought. She always believed that even the worst situations could be transformed into something meaningful if you looked hard enough for the possibility. Tyler had gambled everything on my death and lost. But in losing, he'd accidentally given me the chance to honor his mother's memory in a way that would save lives for generations to come. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. If you found meaning in this story of betrayal, survival, and unexpected redemption, I'd appreciate it if you'd share your thoughts in the comments below. These stories of family, justice, and the complex ways love can manifest even in the darkest circumstances resonate differently with each person who hears them. Your perspective and experiences might help others who are facing their own difficult family situations. And if you'd like to hear more stories about people who found strength in impossible circumstances, there are more waiting for you here. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the mountains and through the complicated landscape of the human heart.